how do we measure it? So I just showed you, anecdotal examples or um, a research study that shows outcomes of a stereotype threat. But how do we actually measure how prejudiced someone is? One of the tricky things about prejudice is we don't even know that we have a prejudice. So one major problem with measuring prejudice is nobody wants to admit that they're prejudiced. So you can't just survey someone and be like, how much do you hate this group? Because no one's going to admit to that, right? So we have what is referred to as the implicit association test, or the IAT, and this is your prompt number 3 if you want to work on the psychology in your own life assignment. But what this test does is it uses reaction time to assess people's unconscious attitudes. So what that means is they have you associate things together. So there are tons of different versions of this. But basically they'll show you either, an African-American face or European-American face in different words like good or bad. And they see how quickly you can respond to, clicking left if it's an African-American face, or right if it's European, left if it's good, right if it's bad, etc. Compared to when they flip-flop what side those races are on. So I believe it's been shown that people are generally quicker when European American is on the same side as good than they are when African American is on the same side as good. So what this is saying is that people tend to associate those words together less and associate these words together more. So by using reaction time, it's an implicit test because we're not directly asking people, and it's not something you could really manipulate. It gets at your unconscious attitude, your unconscious associations. And I want to highlight that just because you have an implicit bias doesn't mean you're a bad person. We all have implicit biases. The real question, the problem, is how you act on those biases. So if you're a police officer and you quickly act and decide to pull out your gun when you have this association, that's problematic. So we all have biases, but we act on them differently. And that's the important thing. Although it's unfortunate that we all carry these prejudices, it's possible to reduce it. So let's talk about some ways that we could potentially reduce the prejudice, the way that we act out on these implicit biases. So the first is increased contact. This sounds kind of obvious, but the more contact you have with people from different groups, different socioeconomic statuses, areas of the world, races, genders, etc., the more effective you are at kind of reducing that prejudice. So that's why, you might have friends or high school groups that, stayed in some hometown bubble where everyone was similar. I don't know about you, my school was not very diverse. So there was a lot of prejudice to the outside minority groups. So once you, associate, once you enter a different environment where there is more diversity, prejudice starts to reduce. Secondly, though, increased cooperation among people. So there's a technique called jigsaw classrooms, which is a way that teachers will often organize their classroom activity that makes students dependent on each other to succeed. So if you've done those group assignments types of things, it forces you to work together with people that you might have not otherwise, because it often will split classes up into mixed groups and people that are not just your friend right next to you that you look just like, but by mixing people up, you're encouraging cooperation, people to work together, and people to get to know each other more than just people who look like them. So this type of jigsaw classroom style has been effective at weakening racial tensions in schools. And it's now a deliberate effort to reduce prejudice in about 80% of elementary schools in the US, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, expanding your definition of what your group is. So instead of focusing on group identities like, these individuals have different genders or races or abilities, instead of focusing on what your group is, focus on what makes you similar instead of different. So for instance, these students are both students at OSU. They're part of the same group in a variety of ways. So focusing on the ways you're similar more than the ways that you're different.